Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm an Airbus A330 pilot, and welcome to our de-icing guide for the Airbus A320 and A330 family aircraft. After watching this video you will be able to understand when to de-ice the aircraft, how to de-ice the aircraft, and which de-icing fluids to use and what their particular advantages are, and finally you will learn how to calculate a holdover time. This is of course just a basic guide for flight simulation over here and doesn't cover the entire topic in its full depth as you would learn it during your airline pilot training, but this guide will get you going from A to B in your flight simulator winter operations. We're going to start this one with a basic question, that is, when do we need to de-ice the aircraft? Well, looking out of the window the answer seems kinda obvious as it is snowing, but that is by far not the only situation in which you might have to de-ice an aircraft. So let's start by putting a little bit of emphasis on the walk-around and what to watch out for when you are doing the walk-around. So during the walk-around in winter conditions like we have them right now, particular emphasis needs to be put on the probes and ports of the aircraft, so the static ports. And then going further forward to the front of the aircraft, we are also putting particular emphasis on the pitot probes, the TAT probes, and any other sensors such as the AOA vanes located over here. Basically anything that might start to freeze on your plane. Now, during the walk-around, you will pay particular attention to any sorts of build-ups of icing on your aircraft. It might seem easy to make the decision whether to de-ice in snowy operations like we have them right now, but how about we just change the weather real quick and go over to a live weather scenario over here in which it is a temperature of plus 10 degrees and no kind of precipitation. It might not seem obvious that you might have to de-ice the aircraft in conditions like these. However, you will notice that especially when conducting the walk-around in the wing area and when looking at any of the areas of the wing, either the leading edges or the areas that are close to the fuel tank, especially towards the root of the wing, that you might find ice buildups over here even in positive temperatures, up to plus 20 degrees Celsius. Now, why is this? The aircraft spends a lot of time at cruising level. Long-haul aircraft even more than short-haul aircraft, but even short-haul aircraft like the A320, with flight times of just about between 1 and 2 hours, can develop negative temperatures on the aircraft's skin, as the aircraft then descends into the warmer atmosphere, which however also is more moist than the air up at cruising level. The negative temperatures of your aircraft's fuselage might lead to that moisture freezing on your aircraft, and therefore creating ice on the plane in a condition where you would normally not expect it. For example, I've had icing on an aircraft all the way in the Canary Islands with temperatures of plus 21 or 22 degrees. And, well, during those temperatures luckily we could just wait a little bit, especially after the warm fuel has been pumped in during the refueling process, and that ice would melt. But the important lesson to take away over here is to pay special attention to your aircraft's fuselage, the leading edges, the engine fan blades, since fan blade de-icing is a particularly interesting point over here, as that needs to be conducted basically with a huge form of a hairdryer, pumping warm air onto the engine and therefore melting any ice that might have built on the fan blades. One more thing to be aware of is hoarfrost. Now, hoarfrost can build on your aircraft's fuselage and is acceptable for dispatch on the entire fuselage and wing, as long as any of the features on the aircraft's surface, such as the lines we see over here and all those parts that are built into it, as long as those can be clearly distinguished. In these cases, hoarfrost is acceptable on your airframe's surface. Now, if you're operating in snowy conditions like we were initially, let's change back over to that. If you're operating in such conditions, then we need to slightly adapt our pre-flight procedure. we need to ensure that any of the pitot and static probes have been removed from the aircraft, like we have them right over here. And when we are back in our cockpit, then we need to turn on the probe and window heat manually. So probe window heat push button goes on manually over here, and that is done in order to ensure that the probes start heating on the ground, which otherwise they would only start after the first engine start has been successful, and therefore they can melt any deposits that might have formed on your probes and ports long before anything malicious can happen. Alright, from here on, let's move forward a little bit in our pre-flight process to the point where we got to decide on the de-icing that will be conducted. Our pre-flight procedures have now been completed and we are preparing the aircraft for our de-icing process. Now the first thing we got to decide is how do we actually want to de-ice the aircraft. So in the real world, normally the provider at the airport, which is normally just one company, will have figured out like, okay, this and that type of de-icing fluid and mixture is the best for the day. However, in flight simulation that is all left to us. So let's understand how to figure out which type of de-icing fluid to use. There's basically 4 types of fluids available, number 1, 2, 3 and 4. And all of them have slightly different characteristics. So number 3, let me preclude that straight away, is not relevant for our commercial Airbus operation. Number 3 is for general aviation aircraft that have rotation speed in the region around 80 knots or slower. So for us, fluids types number 1, 2 and 4 are the interesting ones. Now, fluid type number 1 is basically only used as a de-icing fluid and not an anti-icing fluid. What is the difference between the two? De-icing means actively removing ice from the aircraft. Anti-icing means preventing ice from building up on your aircraft. Now, you can kind of remember this in an easy way. You do have engine anti-ice installed on your aircraft. However, the primary function of engine anti-icing is to heat up your cowling, which therefore prevents ice from building in the first place. So remember, anti-ice prevents ice from building, de-icing removes any existing ice. So fluid type number 1 is a de-icing fluid that is just used in order to remove any deposits you may have on the aircraft. That is the type of fluid that you want to use. For example, if there is no active freezing conditions or no active icing conditions at the airport, but your aircraft already has ice on it from its previous flight. In that case, you would use a fluid type 1 in a single step procedure in order to remove any of the existing ice from your aircraft. Fluid number 2 and number 4, on the other hand side, can both remove ice from your aircraft and prevent ice from building up on your aircraft as well, and they are normally applied in a 2-step procedure. That means the first step is used to remove any of the deposits from your aircraft. The second step is done in order to apply a coat of fluid to your aircraft that will prevent any new ice from forming on your plane. Now, fluid number 2 is, let's say, not as strong as fluid type number 4, but on the other hand side it is cheaper, so whenever you have sufficient holdover time available, you want to use type 2, otherwise you will use type 4. Many large airports are only going to offer you a type 4 fluid because they know how long the delays at the holding points can be when icing conditions exist. Now let's have a look into an example of the different holdover time guidelines that matter for our flight. And for those, I recommend you the FAA holdover time guideline. That is the one that we also use in my current airline and used in my previous airline. So this is the document used by pilots in order to determine their holdover time. A holdover time itself is a time that in which it is guaranteed that your aircraft is going to be clear of deposits, provided that the conditions don't change. Now, you will see on page number 3 on the table of contents that you have several different holdover timelines available for all the different kinds of de-icing fluids. But don't worry, you don't need to know the brand of each of those fluids, even though if you do know the brand, you can get some more exact values. For example, Killfrost ABC is one that's commonly used across Europe. But there are generic tables available as well, which are always a little bit more conservative than the exact tables for each brand of de-icing fluid. Let's have a look at one of those tables, and we're going to start with a Type 1 fluid. And this is an example of a Type 1 holdover time table, and you can see that you need to know the outside conditions, and you need to know the type of precipitation that you currently have. Now, the outside temperature is very easily taken from the METAR. However, with the type of precipitation, you got to be a little bit careful, because things like very light snow, moderate snow, that is given in a METAR, but not applicable for de-icing. So let's have a look at a practical example. There is a chart available, which I'm showing you right now, that is used to determine the snowfall intensity depending on the prevailing visibility. And that is what you use in order to determine your snowfall intensity. So let's have a look at a practical example for this. I've searched for a lovely airport with a little bit of snow, and we all know that Rovaniemi is one of the favorites among flight simmers. And over here we can see we got a visibility of 8,000 meters, light snow from the METAR, and a temperature of -6 degrees. So let's go ahead and check whether this light snow from the METAR is actually light snow for our de-icing operations. So we first of all have to know one basic thing. The table is in statute miles, because why not? Let's make it complicated. However, the visibility is only given in statute miles in the United States. Pretty much the rest of the world uses meters. To make it easy, 1,600 meters equals 1 statute mile. So now let's go into the table. It is daylight at the moment, and the temperature in Rovaniemi is -6. That means we gotta enter the table on the bottom down here, so below -1 in degrees Celsius. Next up, we need to convert our visibility in meters into statute miles, and we do have 8,000 meters, and if we type that into a calculator, 8,000 divided by 1,600, we end up with 5 statute miles visibility. Therefore, we can now go into our table, and you can see that 5 statute miles basically is more than 2, and therefore our snowfall intensity is not light as per the METAR, but it's actually very light for our de-icing purposes. With that information, we go back into the holdover timeline, and then we can see with the temperature in Rovaniemi below -3 to -6 and very light snow, a Type 1 fluid would give us a holdover time between 14 and 17 minutes. Always be aware that the holdover time starts at the beginning of the application of the last step of your de-icing procedure. So in today's example in Rovaniemi, we would have between 14 and 17 minutes. Which time of those to use is the discretion of the commander of the aircraft, from the moment that the last step of the de-icing procedure starts. Now, GSX only knows a single de-icing step, so for that reason we can always take it from the beginning of the de-icing procedure. Therefore, a Type 1 fluid in the current conditions in Rovaniemi would give us 14 minutes, to be conservative here. However, they need about 2 or 3 minutes to complete the procedure. Then you need to start the engines, then you need to taxi out, and you need to be within this holdover time when you commence your takeoff run. Therefore, we can say that 14 minutes is very, very tight under today's conditions, and therefore a Type 1 fluid is not really a good choice for our flight. So let's go a little bit further down and have a look at a Type 2 fluid. So over here, we've got the generic holdover timetable for a Type 2 fluid. Now, if we have a look over here, we got temperatures between -3 to -8. Then we can decide on the different concentration available. So either you want 100% fluid or you want 75% fluid mixed with 25% water. Now you got to decide on the amount of precipitation that exists. So for example, snow. And then you can see that down here, with a 100% concentration, we get between 20 to 40 minutes of holdover time available. And that would be a good call to go for today. So we could take a Type 2 fluid at a 100% concentration, and that would give us between 20 and 40 minutes, which, in the discretion of the commander, should enable us to reach our runway and then take off with a protected aircraft. Now, once this decision has been made, we communicate it as early as possible to the de-icing crew, and then we are going to start the actual de-icing procedure. Both tables will be linked in the video description below. However, in order to always have the most recent data available, I do recommend to Google for FAA holdover time guideline, and you will immediately find the latest version of this document, which is publicly available. The other one, table 3.3 in that document from Scribrary, I will link it in the video description below. And now let's move forward to the actual de-icing procedures. We are now ready to start the actual de-icing procedure, but as always, there's options. So the first question is, where is the de-icing going to happen? Normally, most airports actually de-ice the aircraft at the gate. However, some airports also have remote de-icing positions available. De-icing at the gate is normally done because it means that many aircraft can be de-iced at the same time, while de-icing at remote positions is usually done if the weather conditions are so that the achievable holdover times are very, very low, and therefore de-icing areas are typically located close to the runway. Now, since we do have Lido charts available by default in FS24, let me show you what these areas look like on the ground chart. So you can see that over here you can find de-icing area west, and over here you can find de-icing area east over here at Düsseldorf Airport. Now, where the de-icing is conducted is normally told to the pilots, either by the ramp agent or by the de-icing crews. For example, at my home base Frankfurt, we have to call the de-icing crews around 40-45 minutes prior to the actual time at which de-icing is requested, and they will inform us exactly where it's going to happen and give us a frequency to talk to the de-icing crew, which actually have really cool call signs, typically Iceman. And that way we learn where the de-icing is conducted. Now, as mentioned, as long as the weather isn't so that you only have very, very short holdover times, the normal de-icing location on most airports around the world is the gate prior to engine start. Now, if de-icing is conducted prior to engine start, we can run the airframe de-icing anti-icing procedure on ground straight from the FCOM. If de-icing is conducted at a remote location, you would do a normal pushback, start your engines, but do not do a flight control check and do not extend the flaps, so that no damages can occur due to any of the ice on the aircraft. Also, you don't want to extend the flaps early so that no de-icing fluid can get into the mechanics of your flap mechanism. Now let's get started with the actual airframe de-icing anti-icing procedure on the ground. First things first, GSX is a little limited over here. As soon as you tell GSX that you want de-icing, they come, and if you don't make a choice on the fluid within a certain amount of time, it will just automatically start the procedure, regardless whether your aircraft is prepared for de-icing or not. That is different in the real world. In the real world, the de-icing crews come, and they are normally really busy, so you want to be as quick as possible once they are there, but you always have to take your time to prepare the aircraft. Now, what do we prepare the aircraft for? Basically, we ensure that all of the valves on the outside of the aircraft are closed, so that no de-icing fluid can get into your aircraft, and that includes the engine and APU bleeds as well. Now, de-icing fluid itself is highly toxic to humans, and there have been cases where de-icing fluid did enter the air conditioning system, which led to one pilot passing out completely. The other one was barely conscious, even under the oxygen mask, and could just about bring the aircraft back for an automatic landing. So that is the huge risk involved with de-icing. You got to prevent that fluid from getting into your aircraft. and into your air conditioning system. So let's go ahead and have a look into the airframe de-icing anti-icing procedure on ground from the Airbus FCOM. The first step is to establish communication with ground crew, because that fluid is equally toxic to the ground crew like it is to you, and it is very slippery, but that's for another point. So you check that the fluid type is appropriate, and you do not start the engines during fluid spray. The engines can be running, but that's only for remote de-icing, and the same procedure applies if the engines are running or not, but don't start them within that procedure. So the next step is to check that the cabin pressurization mode selector is in the auto position. It looks a little different between the A330 and the A320, but basically that one got to be in auto. Then we turn off the 2 engine bleeds, so engine 1 bleed off, and engine 2 bleed off, APU bleed off, and like that we now prevent anything from entering the air conditioning system. The next step is to turn on the ditching push button, and that is done so that any of the valves on the outside of the aircraft close automatically. So ditching push button on. After that we move down to the pedestal and check the pressurization page to ensure that the outflow valves both close. This is a bug in the inbuilt A330 at this moment. These valves should be closed, and you gotta check that they are closed. If they don't close automatically at this point, your aircraft is not airworthy. So let's assume that they are closed in order to continue this tutorial. So next we check that the thrust levers are in the idle position. And with that, our aircraft is prepared for spraying. So this is a good moment to call GSX and to tell them, yes, I want de-icing. And then we can decide on the fluid types to use. And as we briefed earlier, let's continue using our example from Rovaniemi. We're going to use a Type 2 fluid at a 100% concentration. Now, once the de-icers arrive, you will start to see them do their work. There is one general principle. In the real world, they will always ask you, which parts of the aircraft do you want de-iced? And GSX currently is only capable of de-icing the wings. In the real world, however, you would normally do the stabilizers, both horizontal and vertical, as well as a minimum, because if there is ice on the wings, chances are there is also ice on the stabilizers, and that is very, very hard to see from the ground, especially if we are talking about clear ice. Now, our de-icing crew is arriving. We would be in contact with them through the radio. There is a designated frequency in each airport, and in case there are several handling operators, normally also for the different operators. Now, we mentioned we wanted to use a Type 2 fluid at a concentration of 100%, and you can see that this is quite different from the GSX default choice. The default choice normally is not really very good. So, only make those selections once the aircraft is prepared for de-icing, in order to prevent any de-icing fluid from entering the aircraft or the air conditioning system. So you can see that now the de-icing procedure starts, and this is going to take a little while now, and when that is completed, we can continue our procedure. The de-icing procedure is now complete, and now we've got to note down 2 information of time. First of all, when did the de-icing start and when did the de-icing stop? That information is important for 2 reasons. First of all, the start of the de-icing needs to be used for the holdover time calculation. The end of the de-icing needs to be used because we need to apply a certain minimum amount of time before turning our bleeds back on. So let's go ahead and continue with the procedure itself. Once the de-icing procedure is complete, the ground crew would conduct the so-called post-treatment check. And in the post-treatment check, they verify that all the pedos and the statics are clear and that no fluid accidentally got into them. And they verify that the treatment was successful, so that any of the icing we needed to remove has actually been removed from the aircraft itself. So the de-icing report is then received, which includes information about the type of the fluid used, the ratio of fluid to water, the time at which the holdover time begins, and the result of the post-application check. So basically, aircraft critical parts are clean. When that is received, and only when that is received, we are going to run the next part of the procedure, which is going to be ditching push button off. And then we once again check proper movement of the outflow valve. So at this point you want to see the outflow valves opening again. And once again, if they don't, then you are not airworthy anymore, and you are going to stay right where you are and go back home. Now, when that's done, at least 1 minute after the completion of the spraying operation, you can turn the engine bleeds back on. And for that we needed the time when the de-icing procedure has stopped. So we do have at least 1 minute now, so we can go to air, engine 1 bleed on, air, engine 2 bleed on. At least 5 minutes after completion of the spraying operation, we are going to turn on the APU bleed. Now, why is there a difference between the two? That's because of where the different intake locations are along your aircraft. So the engine bleeds are obviously inside the engines. As a general rule, de-icing fluid must never be sprayed into an engine. Therefore, we only take 1 minute before we can turn the engine bleeds on, so that any of the mist that may have developed during the spraying has dissipated. The APU bleed, on the other hand side, is located on the back of the aircraft and in an area where fluid might actively be sprayed. Therefore, since fluid might be located everywhere around here on your aircraft, we need to wait a little bit longer, 5 minutes, to ensure that no fluid can actually go into the air conditioning inlet for the APU and therefore into the air conditioning system. Now, when all of that is done and when those 5 minutes have passed, the APU bleed can be turned back on. Last but not least, a small note over here. You can see that GSX has turned on the engine and wing anti-ice internally. Now, absolute no-go. Do not turn on the engine or wing anti-ice at this point. And if GSX does it, honestly, just shut it back down again. Especially wing anti-ice must not be used if fluid has been sprayed onto the wings. So the background for that is that the holdover times are calculated based on a cold wing. If wing anti-ice is turned on and therefore the wing is heated up, that changes the viscosity of the de-icing and anti-icing fluids and therefore invalidates the holdover times. Therefore, only use engine anti-ice if your aircraft is to be de-iced or actually has been de-iced. Now, once 5 minutes are over, the APU bleed is going to be turned on again, and thereafter you're going to resume the normal procedures. Now, the last thing worth mentioning here is that since the probe and window heat is turned on, after the first engine start, you will turn off the probe window heat, because at that point, once one engine is started, the Airbus is automatically going to turn it on, even if the button is in the auto position. Well, and that concludes this part of the tutorial. Then I see you again a little bit later as we taxi towards our runway. We have now completed our pushback procedure and the engine start, and during the after start procedure we once again got to make a decision. If there is active precipitation or any sort of contamination on the airport surfaces that might cause your flaps to become contaminated, you would leave them retracted for taxi. If on the other end side there is no such contamination and no icing or freezing conditions exist at the time of taxi, you can already extend your flaps into your desired takeoff position. Otherwise, delay that until you reach the holding point. Also, note how I have only turned on engine anti-ice and not wing anti-ice for today's departure. So, with that out of the way, I will keep my flaps up for today's taxi. Since the visibility isn't that good and we have to consider the possibility of some freezing fog over here, and then we can taxi to our runway. Also, note that usage of engine anti-ice is going to increase the idle N1, and you can see right now our A330 taxis really quickly, so we've got to manage our brake temperatures and manage the amount of brake applications that we use. So let's taxi to the runway, and then I see you over there. We're now approaching our departure runway, and since there is no indication of any delay for the takeoff, let's go ahead and extend the flaps into the takeoff position, and then we can also commence our flight control check. During the flight control check in these icing operations, be very sure that you observe that the flight controls really move to their absolute full extent, and be sure to keep them there for a short while so that the computers can recognize if anything is wrong with your flight control check. Well, and with that we've reached our departure runway. The rest of the procedures is basically normal procedures, with one exception. Just prior to conducting your takeoff, you need to verify that your holdover time is still valid. So the way you determine this is quite easy. You take the beginning of the de-icing, which was at 1230 today. Now it's 1249er, and you will remember that we calculated 20 minutes of holdover time in our example. Now, the holdover time guideline was 20 to 40 minutes. We're at 20 minutes now, so we can easily say, yeah, we are within the limits of our holdover time. And like that, we are now cleared for takeoff towards the sun and into warmer areas. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. I sure hope that you enjoyed this tutorial. I hope that it makes your winter operations a little bit more realistic. Leave your feedback in the comments below, and always remember that I did somewhat simplify this procedure a little bit in order to make it more comprehensible and easier to use in the world of flight simulation. Thank you very much for watching. Be sure to like, comment and subscribe, and if you really love what I'm doing on this channel, would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me Coffee link in the video description below. Last but not least, as this is such a nice view outside, always remember, don't taxi too closely to other aircraft. You can see what happens behind those aircraft over here. So don't taxi into any of the jet blast of other aircraft, as that is almost immediately going to invalidate your holdover time. Thank you very much for watching. Be sure to like, comment and subscribe, and if you really love what I'm doing, I would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me Coffee link in the video description below. Thank you very much, and I'll see you on the next one.